Welcome to the Kairotic Flow Learning Series. My name is Kylie Stedman-Gomes, and I'm here with you today to bring some insights I've discovered from looking through the lens of what I call the Cycle of Kairotic Flow. The cycle is graphically represented here in its simplest form, a purple and orange circle of 6 sequential archetypes of life activities, connected by arrows which represent the key dynamics between them. In today's episode, I'll be diving in to explore a word I'm using a lot as I write and talk about Kairotic flow. That word is substrates. We see the world through not only our eyes and our other senses, but through the lens of our worldview or paradigm. The worldview nearly all of us grew up with, and still, by and large, the cultural water we're all swimming in, is what we might call a mechanistic paradigm. In this paradigm, nature is effectively viewed as a machine made up of related but individual discrete components that can be pulled apart, inspected, and eventually understood through analysis and the scientific method, and then controlled. The way humans are viewed in this paradigm is, frankly, somewhat paradoxical. On the one hand, humans are seen as also being like machines made up of parts, with our control center located mostly in the squishy brain part. In the mechanistic worldview, it's also common to view an individual human being as being part in the machinery of society and the economy. We measure and categorize our parts, our identities, and each other like we're really just cogs with different shapes, sizes, and functions. The paradoxical aspect that I referred to before is that we also tend to think of humans as the creative source of all value that's worth measuring. Although the mechanistic paradigm has us thinking of ourselves as machines, it also says that humans are separate from and able to control nature. Kairotic flow provides a lens into the still emerging ecological paradigm, which deeply challenges the mechanistic paradigm in a number of ways. First and foremost, perhaps, the ecological worldview rejects the idea that humans are in any way separate from nature. We are living entities, fully interdependent with the rest of life and with the entirety of all that is, living and non-living alike. The ecological paradigm emphasizes the whole and the relationships of, in, and between entities, and between living organisms and the habitats in which they continuously learn and live. The mechanistic paradigm served our science and technology and understanding of causality well for a long time. But ultimately, because it leaves so many crucial interconnections and values out of the picture, it has done so at the expense of life. The idiom penny wise and pound foolish is actually a great mechanistic metaphor to describe the limits of the mechanistic worldview. The issue is not that there is no truth in the mechanistic worldview, but that it is myopic. Switching to an ecological metaphor now, we've been attending so closely to the uses that we can make of a tree that we have lost sight of the forest. Looking at the bigger picture of what's going on in our world, the mechanistic worldview is one that life can no longer afford. You might have noticed that when you heard penny wise and pound foolish, your first thoughts or associations were of things like money, bank accounts, accounting, financial cost savings, and so on. You might even have thought of business decisions, analysis, and models. One association leads to another, which leads to another, all clustering together and hanging together in a way that makes everything cohere and feel consistent and logical, even necessary. Sometimes this reinforcement is obvious, but more often it happens in a subtle way that we may not notice at all. The language of a worldview keeps us trapped inside it, like a silo. And so the words in the right-hand column, which express concepts appropriate to an ecological worldview, may not be familiar to you, or may feel slippery or uncomfortable or fuzzy or unnecessarily complex. I won't go into all of them in this video, just the colored ones. Structure, as used in a term like infrastructure, tends to reinforce the mechanistic view, which prioritizes human creations. To prioritize the needs of life, as required for the ecological worldview, I propose instead using the word substrate. I think this is an important distinction to make because we humans build and maintain many structures that aren't necessary to life. That's the red part of the circle on the left. Structures like advertising and rockets have functions, and we certainly use them, but life would survive just fine without them. When we're stuck in the silo of the mechanistic worldview, we also tend to ignore a lot of substrates that life needs, but that humans didn't build. This is the green section of the circle on the right, which covers substrates that life needs, such as air, water, plants, animals, and the ability to procreate. Sure, we extract value from many of those substrates, and we rely on them, but we rarely account for them. Focused as we are on our own creations, all too often we take the substrates that we need and that life graces us with completely for granted. Now, of course, there are structures that humans have built, which we do now need for life. This is represented by the olive-colored area of overlap between the two circles. Examples of these human-built structures, which are also substrates, include shelter, power, and heating. Whether the things we have built and come to rely on are always necessary or not is another question, but for now, it is enough to notice that they exist. At this point, you might be thinking, yeah, so what? Why can't we just use the same word to talk about ecology? A tree is a structure. The dams beavers build can be called structures, right? Well, this is precisely what we do right now. We use the word structure for all of these things, but it places our focus in the wrong place and always requires us to use building in a metaphorical sense and be conscious that we're doing this. If you look at the root or the etymology of the word structure, it's easy to see why. The word comes from the Latin root struere, which means to build. It has the laboring, creative component built into it. It's much easier to think of roads as infrastructure, for example, than it is to think of food as infrastructure. The word substrate doesn't contain that meaning. It is a compound word made up from the Latin roots sub, which means under, and stratum, which means layer. Even if the word itself is unfamiliar to you, it's not at all new in the English language. Biologists and geologists use it as a way of talking about dependencies. Soil is substrate for a tree. The tree might be substrate for an insect. The insect might be substrate for a bird, and so on. The key point here is that the lens we use, the worldview we use, really matters because it changes what we focus on and what we can see. If we focus on substrates first, we can make much wiser choices overall because life has needs, we have needs, and meeting them is not negotiable. Wasting the resources needed for life on stuff we don't need to live is a fool's game. To be clear, unless a human-built structure also has a substrate function for life, and this includes but is not limited to human life, we shouldn't waste resources on continuing it. So let's shift now to the ecological worldview and focus on substrates, on what is needed to support life. The green circle here represents all of the substrates needed for life. The olive rectangle inside the circle represents all of the substrates that humans have built. The dotted line that runs through the circle is a visibility line. You've probably seen this kind of representation before, usually in the form of an iceberg. Above the line is visible, like the part of the iceberg we can see above the surface of the water. Under the line is much less visible. If we can see clearly through the water in the right lighting conditions, we may realize that there is more iceberg under the surface, but we've also learned that our eyes play tricks on us when we're looking at what is under the water, and there is always plenty hidden down there that we can't really see at all. This is life, reflected in the cycle of Kairotic flow as well. The orange side of the Kairotic flow cycle, on the right-hand side of the Kairotic flow diagram, tends to be very visible to us, rather like the iceberg in well-lit conditions. The archetypes on the orange side of Kairotic flow are pioneer, cultivator, and regulator. The left side of the Kairotic flow diagram, colored in purple, tends to be less visible to us. But it's important to recognize that just because we can't see clearly what is going on there doesn't make it any less important. Hidden though it may be, The underwater part of an iceberg is still part of the iceberg, and it can still sink a ship if not taken into account. The archetypes on this less visible purple side of Kairotic flow are steward, curator, and scout. Some substrates are more visible than others, and this is true of both human-made and non-human-made substrates. Some examples of visible human-made substrates are buildings, grocery stores, roads, and power lines, all presently needed for life, all visible. Human-made substrates that we can't usually see so clearly include building foundations, electricity, and supply chains for food. Of the substrates that humans don't build, we can usually see land, water, trees, animals, and rain. It is harder, if not impossible, to directly see many other substrates we rely on, such as air, mycelium, time, feelings, and gravity. Now notice in this diagram that both the watering can in the circle labeled market and the water pipe in the circle labeled state are visible structures built by humans. The circle labeled commons contains the image of rain coming from a cloud. Rain is visible, at least until it soaks into the ground or evaporates, but it is not human-made and not within human control. The watering can, water pipe, and rain cloud are metaphorical representations of three different approaches to resource allocation. In the mechanistic worldview, which focuses on what humans have built, only the two human-built approaches of watering cans and water pipes come into focus when we think about resource allocation and distribution. We're all familiar with these market and state approaches, and even more so if we use the mechanistic paradigm word money instead of the more ecological word resources. Commons, not so much. Looking through the mechanistic lens, we might even make the mistake of assuming that commons means communism. Of course, it doesn't mean that. Commons really only become apparent through the lens of the ecological paradigm when we use words like substrates and resources and metaphors like water. Even then, many commons like air, like an organism's genome, like the relationships between human beings, aren't visible either. So in the mechanistic worldview, commons are almost entirely overlooked unless they're being extracted from. Through the mechanistic lens, commons even get called names like natural resources, as if they only exist for us to take them and exploit them. In the mechanistic paradigm, common substrates are habitually redirected to market and state and are not replenished. Now, clearly, if we zoom out to look at the bigger picture through an ecological lens, this extractive approach is not sustainable. Common substrates need replenishing with the resources they need to survive and thrive, like everything else. And this resourcing can't be done with watering cans or water pipes, which humans have built to direct resources towards visible and usually human-built substrates. Common substrates need a rain approach, which doesn't pretend it knows enough to choose where resources should go. Rain comes from clouds, which, through the ecological lens, we might see as pools of resources continually gathering together and ready to be distributed, rather randomly, across the whole landscape of possibility for life to use as best it can. And this is where I leave you with a question to consider, one I'm still holding myself. Through the lens of the mechanistic worldview, the word accounting is generally associated with money. Balance sheets, spreadsheets, profit and loss statements, budgets, cash flows, and the like. It's almost entirely quantitative, measuring with numbers, dividing into the tiniest pieces, and exerting control over where those pieces go and when and under what circumstances. But an account can also be entirely qualitative and descriptive. An account can be a story, an explanation, history. So what might accounting look like through an ecological lens? How might we base accounting on resourcing for qualitative needs of and for substrates, rather than quantifying based on the cost of supply and measures of demand of, by, and for human-built structures? To the right, in the green font, you can see some etymology of common accounting terms: revenue or income, expense, asset, and liability. I find it interesting to note that when it comes to etymology, none of those terms necessarily refers to money or even requires quantification. Revenue can be seen as meaning return or come back. Expense can be seen as meaning pay out or expend, like expending energy or resources. The roots of the concepts of assets and liabilities are especially fascinating to me. Asset essentially means enough. Think of the Latin root satis, found in words like satisfy. And liability, well, it comes from the Latin root legare, which means to bind or to tie. So what if, through an ecological lens, we thought of human-built structures that are not needed for life, that are not substrates, as being liabilities or debts, tying or binding us to approaches that waste the resources needed for life? Might we then be able to attend to stopping those wasteful processes and instead pooling those resources into clouds to rain onto the commons that we do need? How might we ensure that the commons have enough resources and substrates to sustain life? Thank you for watching. If you would like to learn more about Kairotic Flow or support the continuing work of bringing it out to the world, please subscribe to the Kairotic Flow Emerging Substack at kairoticflow.substack.com. If you would like to use Kairotic Flow in any commercial capacity, be coached in using it, or have a certified practitioner apply its insights specifically to your personal or business context, please contact me at email kylie@presenceofmind.com.au or visit my business website, presenceofmind.com. Until next time.